Welcome to the Counselling Tutor Podcast, the must-listen-to podcast for students of counselling and psychotherapy. Here are your hosts, Rory Lees-Oakes and Ken Kelly.
Hello, I'm Rory, and with me, as always, my good friend and colleague in the field that is phenomenological, Ken. How you doing, Ken?
I'm exceptionally well, Rory. Great to be here on the Counselling Tutor Podcast. A very warm welcome to you. And this is episode 108, and a great episode today. We're going to be kicking off speaking about linking theory to personal development. A really good topic there. We need to look at our personal development as counsellors, and we're asked to kind of link that to the theory we might be studying in assignments. So we're going to be chatting about that. Moving into practice matters, letter writing to other professionals. This is so important, and again, it's one of those topics that's usually only considered when you've been requested for the letter, Rory. Always a better idea to think about it beforehand, I guess.
I think so, and yes, you'd be surprised how often a counsellor may be asked to write a letter to other professionals. I'm going to go through the types of professionals who may request a letter from you, how to go about it, and most importantly, how to work with the clients on that and work in the service of the client with, of course, the word that we always stick by in our profession, which is confidentiality.
Love it. You're going to stick with us for that one. That is well worth listening to. And then we end episode 108 today speaking about a topic, working with a client's emotional age. It's going to be an interesting one to explore that. But let's get straight on to our first topic. This is that linking theory to our personal development.
Yes, and all the courses that I've ever taught and all the courses that I know that go on in the field of counselling training always and usually at the end of the course ask students to consider how the theories they've studied have impacted on their own lives. And it's just so important, because if we're applying theory to clients, then we should apply it to ourselves. It's all about having a better understanding of our own process, and can be very useful. It can, in some cases, form a kind of mini instruction book to us, understanding what our behaviours are, what drives our behaviours, and also can link to that very important personal therapy to explore, within the theory, maybe that someone's looked at some theory and said, well, there's a lot of interjected values when I was a child, or a lot of injunctions, or there's lots of things that aren't been completed for our friends in the Gestalt world, the stuff that's still talked about. And that's a really good lesson for us to take to our own personal therapy to explore. It's a door opener, I think, for more personal exploration and more personal growth.
Yeah, and this topic actually came up on our Facebook group, as do many of the topics we bring to the Counselling Tutor Podcast. If you want to be part of the conversation on our Facebook group, get into Facebook and just put in Counselling Tutor. It's as simple as that. There we are. Come and join tens of thousands of like-minded professionals, students, people interested and involved in the world of counselling, and come and join in those conversations. And this topic, really interesting, because yes, we're called as students to write about our personal development and link that to theory, but I found that really useful in that post-study, post-graduation, out into private practice, working, I still do it today because I find it fun, and it's something that is not just limited to a student. It's worth doing. It's worth looking at ourselves. And I remember the first time looking, it was difficult for me to see it. It was easier for me to potentially see it in a potential client. So in skills work, I could see the interjected values in another. But when I looked to self, it was almost like I was slightly blinded, Rory. And it took some real exploration into self for me to be able to link those theories. And very often the simulated skills sessions I would have with a little bit of feedback from a peer, they would mention things that would kind of bring that theory and my own personal development into awareness. And I think it's something that once I found it has been a gift ever since.
Absolutely. I mean, we have legendary conversations at Counselling Towers about the transference, counter-transference and projection, because it's something that I encounter if I go out and about a lot. People projecting their stuff onto you is something that happens a lot. Freud wasn't, I guess, too far wrong. And interjected values and conditions of worth, it really does give you an insight not only into your own process and how you relate to other people, but how other people are related to you. And I've just recently done a lecture on this in the Counselling Study resource. It's a full hour's lecture where we talk about how to do that. I know there might be people listening who are in the process of writing those assignments. How to do it. There's a key, there's a formula of how to get that theory that you've been studying and how to bring it across and map it to your own stuff, for want of a better word.
And if you're new to the Counselling Tutor Podcast, Counselling Tutor itself, what Rory's speaking about when he's speaking about the Counselling Study resources, we have so much free information. Our website is free at counsellingtutor.com. This podcast is certainly free. To join our Facebook, Counselling Tutor is free, but we do offer a paid-for, more robust service where we provide resources for our qualified colleagues, continuing professional development lectures linked to CPD certificates. But we have a really massive study section, and as Rory said there, recently just did a lecture just about an hour on linking your theory to your personal development. And I guess looking at that in your college, your university, your learning institution, very often you'll be asked to kind of link your personal development to the main theory that you are studying. So if that is person-centered, you'd be looking at those 7 stages of process. You're going to be looking at where you those introjected values, those conditions of worth, as you mentioned, Rory. And I guess for me, what was really interesting and again exciting, I love the exploration of self, and I learned it in my training, and I'm so grateful for it because it continues today, is that as I went on, as I did continuing professional development, started learning about other modalities, transaction analysis, I was able to take the new theories that I was learning and link them into self as well. And it was really interesting kind of looking across that, how when you look at your self-development, you link that into the theories, how similar the theories are in some ways. So if you look at, you were speaking about injunctions, drivers, and if you look at introjected values, there's similarities there in I guess, the base modalities. And when we're able to map that to ourselves, I think it can empower us to see that clearer in the presentations that our clients bring.
Yeah, absolutely. Because if you're kind of living the theory yourself, then it becomes familiar, doesn't it? You go along and you go, maybe that's an introjective value, maybe that's an irrational thought, or an automatic negative thought. Maybe that's a game that someone's playing if you're looking at the TA theory, or a script. There's so much in it, and it's just so helpful. And one of the things that strikes me, Ken, is this stuff isn't taught in schools, as far as I know, to any great depth. I think that that there is an argument for teaching this kind of theory to young people so they can understand themselves better before they get to a point where they're kind of sometimes get into crisis by understanding their own motivations. I think it could be useful. Maybe it should go on the curriculum.
Yeah. It's so important, and you're 100% right. It's all so externalized and not so much internalized. Yet we have the saying, the unexamined life is not worth living. And it's only when we start looking internally that we find that richness and the pain. Come on, there's pain there too for it's part of the human condition, I guess. But learning about ourselves. And you were speaking about it, Rory, about the lecture that you did on that. And in our lecture, you got to do a real deep dive on that. And if you are a student and you are called upon to write a journal, keep a journal, or link your growth to your personal development, just a couple of quick tips. One of the ways of doing that is to have a list of the theory in front of you. So if your base modality is person-centered, have a list of all the theories that are person-centered, put them in front of you as you're kind of thinking through it, and look at each one of them. So look at introjected values and say, how does that apply to me? Do I have any introjected values? And great exercises that you can do with peers. Johari's window is, and ask a peer specifically, in working with me, what do you see in me that I don't see in myself? And how might you link that to theory? So we get an external eye on that, and that can kind of free up that process and enable us to better see that and be able to write about it in those assignments.
Yeah, absolutely. Johari's window, Gestalt letter, where people are sometimes asked to write a letter to someone where there's some uncompleted business. That used to be a favourite of mine when I taught, and a really powerful exercise. You write a letter to someone you may not know, may not see anymore, or may not be around anymore because they've died. You can write a letter to them, get it all off your chest. And then you can decide what you want to do with the letter. You can either burn it, or you can keep it, or maybe you want to send it. And, that's a really useful piece of Gestalt theory, really useful in personal development. Although I would say that if you're going to do that, you might want a bit of support. It's usually done in a supportive environment where people can process what they've written, because it's mighty, mighty powerful, let me tell you.
Yeah. Oh, very so. We did it on a residential, Rory. Thinking back, I remember it, a Gestalt letter. I didn't burn mine. I still have it. I kept it just as kind of a reminder of that time. So I guess if a message, I want to put a challenge out, if you're qualified, so you've qualified, when we're students, we're kind of required, you got to journal. Some learning institutions, you've got to hand that journal in, and it's looked at, and it counts towards your final portfolio, your final piece of work. But once we're qualified, there's nobody asking us to do this, to link our own personal journeys to theory, and many of us do. But if you are qualified, and you have been for some years, and you're not doing that, then my challenge is take some time, have a look at your personal journey and link that to theory. So much can come up, I guess.
Absolutely, and I think supervisors should be, in my supervision practice, I'm always saying to supervisees, so if you're thinking about the theory and this feeling's coming up, where you are, in fact, it's part of the 7-9 model of supervision, isn't it? One specific area is transference and counter-transference. But, in that particular mode of supervising, you can go anywhere, and sometimes it's really a rich seam of understanding why there may be resistance with a client, or you're feeling over attracted to a client just by looking at the theory, just by looking at what you've learnt. So that should really be alive, I think, in supervision.
Yeah, me too. I definitely believe in that. It's just so interesting. Then learning more about us and ourselves, linking that to theory, we are of better service to the client at the end of the day. And that's why we do this, to be in service of the client. So there you have it, linking theory to personal development. Really, really interesting topic, evergreen, something we can visit again and again and again, because it's fluid and it changes, almost like a river. You can never stand in the same river twice. So we're moving on now to Practice Matters, where we kind of look at what happens within practice and the elements of that. And Rory brings a specialist topic, and today you're looking at letter writing to other professionals.
I am, Ken. What happens if you've got a client who may need another form of support? You may have a client who you start off using counselling with, and you discover they've got quite a difficult psychiatric issue that needs attention from a different form of a professional. So you may have to write a referral letter to a doctor or a psychiatrist. What happens if you get a client that turns up and says that as part of a court process, the client's been asked to undertake counselling, and you have to write a letter either to the court or to the probation service to say the client's attended counselling? How do you do that? How do you negotiate it? And more crucially, what do you put in the letter? How do you balance confidentiality with complying with a third person's desire to have confirmation of attendance at therapy? I'm going to go through that. I'm also going to talk about the Caldecott principles, just to remind us again of good practice in information sharing.
All that and, of course, much more from Rory and Practice Matters after this very short message. And we were speaking just earlier about our paid-for service, counselling study resource, over 50 hours of continuing professional development for qualified counsellors, massive resources for students. Here's a little bit of more information on that. Take the stress out of your counselling studies and get the support of Rory and I by joining us in the Counselling Study Resource. See how Counselling Study Resource can help you. Visit counsellingtutor.com. That's counsellingtutor.com.
One of the many tasks a busy therapist has to undertake is the writing of letters to various agencies for or on behalf of the client. Correspondence to other professionals tends to be varied. For example, a letter to a doctor referring a client on because they're experiencing psychotic symptoms, or maybe they're actively considering taking their own life. You may be asked by a client to write a letter to their solicitors confirming attendance or giving a brief overview of the difficulties they are trying to resolve in therapy. Some qualified counsellors who work for employee assistance programs,
known as EAPs, may need to confirm the number of sessions the client has attended, and some ask for copies of notes, and you would get the client's permission. That would be in the contract, so the client would know exactly what you were sending and who you were sending it to. Although it's unusual for a court to order anyone to attend counselling, a therapist can be approached by a client who may need some therapy to satisfy a court order concerning a child custody case or an antisocial behavioural order known as an ASBO. And I've experienced two of these where I've had someone phone up who was trying to get joint custody of their child, and as part of that process had been asked by the court to get some anger management therapy, difficulties around anger, and also someone who was challenging an antisocial behaviour order and had been advised to get some therapy. So it's unusual for a court to order anyone to attend counselling, but sometimes counselling can be part of a wider court order that it's suggested that someone undertakes. It looks good, in other words, when it goes before the court, if there seem to be active and getting some kind of help. When writing letters, it's important to remember that the client can request copies under the UK General Data Protection Regulations. It's also known as GDPR. They can also ask for any copies of responses you receive, in which case this request needs to be dealt with by the sender, not yourself. So if you write a letter to a doctor, the doctor writes a letter back to you, and the client asks for both those copies, yes, you can release your copy, but the client really needs to contact the doctor to get them to release their copy of the correspondence, because they are the sender. Particular care has to be given if your letter includes comments from a third party. So as an example, maybe you've got a client who has spoken to someone at the reception of your practice and says they're going to commit some self-harm, or maybe try to take their own lives, and you include those comments to reinforce your concerns when writing to a doctor. What you'd have to be careful of is that if the client asks for a copy of the letter, the person who's working at the reception, their comments, you either had permission to share it, in which case you need to get written permission, or if not, you'd have to redact it. In other words, what you'd have to do is remove or write over the part of the letter where someone else has spoken. So that's called redacting. Usually this kind of thing's taken care of by the practice manager, who would oversee data protection within your organisation. If you're a student and this happens and you have to write a letter and you have to include someone else's comments, speak with your practice manager first before you do anything, and they will guide you with what you may need to know and what you may have to do. When writing any information about a client, it's always useful to remember the Caldecott principles on information sharing. Now, I'll put a link into the handout on the Caldecott principles, but they were basically principles designed to give professionals a guidance on if they're having to share information, what they need to share, and how it should be shared. And there are 7 principles. There were originally 6, but there's now 7. They've added another principle in over the last couple of years. So the first principle is justify the purpose for using confidential information. Why would you use confidential information? If you're asked, why did you send a letter to a doctor, you would justify the purpose by saying, well, I was very concerned this client had a medical issue that was affecting the person's mental health, and it may need doctor's input, and the client wanted some help and agreed to the letter being written. The second principle is don't use personal confidential data unless it's absolutely necessary. So effectively, you need to share only what is pressing. So you wouldn't share absolutely everything, and and you wouldn't talk about what else the client was talking about. So say, for instance, the client wanted you to write a letter to the doctor because they had psychosis. You wouldn't write information saying that they may be having trouble in their work or their job. You just talk about exactly what you're referring them for, and keep it to that. And that links in really to Principle 3, which is use the minimum necessary personal confidential data. So you'd only share what was pertinent to the letter or the referral. Principle 4 is access to personal confidential data should be on a strict need-to-know basis. So in times when I've written letters to professionals, I've usually rung forward first, spoken to who I need to speak to, and found out exactly who it is I need to send the information to. So I just wouldn't send a general letter to the doctor at the doctor's surgery. I would find out from the client who their GP was, or who they saw, and I would mark it private and confidential, and I would send it strictly to the person who I know is going to receive it, or if it's a case of a body, such as the Department of Work and Pensions, the particular domain that would deal with the letter. So I just wouldn't send it off without finding out who it's going to, in other words. Principle 5 is everyone with access to personal and confidential data should be aware of their responsibilities. So anybody who's a professional should be aware of, if they're accessing personal data, should be aware of what data they can access, and also when they can share it. What's their responsibilities around personal data? Principle 6 is comply with the law, which in this case would cover general data protection regulations. And the final principle, which, as I said, is a new principle, is the duty to share information can be as important as the duty to protect patient confidentiality. So Principle 7 gives equal weight to sharing information, certainly if it's about a child protection issue, but it gives equal weight to the duty to protect the patient's confidentiality. So yes, it does provide, there is a balance to be had there. And, if you send information and a complaint is made, you may have to justify the reasons that you've done it. Finally, don't forget that if you're writing letters, keep copies of all correspondence and refer to it in your clinical notes. So if you have to write a letter, just put it in your clinical notes. I wrote a letter today to whoever, and the reason the letter was written, and make a note you've kept a copy of the letter.
Thank you as always, Rory. It's interesting when you kind of sit down and think of it, how many different types of letters there are and how they can differ, from maybe giving a report to writing a referral to giving feedback to an agency. There's so many, they take so many different forms, and such an important topic. And of course, if you want to get Rory's super duper handout from today's Practice Matters, it's free. All you need to do is go to our website. It is counsellingtutor.com. 2 L's in counselling. We're based in the UK. Counsellingtutor.com. Right at the top of the website page, you will see our podcast tab. Click on the podcast tab and find your way to episode 108. That's 108. That's today's episode. All of the show notes from today's episodes are there, with any links to external resources that maybe kind of tie into today's topics. And right there on that page, you can get Rory's super duper handout on letter writing to other professionals as a counsellor, and you just put in your name and email address and we can send that through to you. Alternatively, if you are already a member of the CSR, the Counselling Study Resource, our paid for service, well, that handout has already been added to your handouts vault. All you need to do is log in and it is there waiting for you. So we're moving now from Practice Matters into working with a client's emotional age. Interesting topic, Rory.
It is. And, we tend to, when we talk about age, we tend to talk about how old someone is chronologically. So, in the line of years going by. So I'm 60. So you think that someone in front of you is 60. But actually, if someone comes to see you, a client comes to see you, it may be that emotionally they're a lot younger. They come from a place that hasn't developed into being a 60-year-old. And we can see this in a number of ways. Sometimes people have had very difficult childhoods, may very well get stuck at a certain emotional age, certainly when they're looking at emotional issues. So it doesn't mean that someone who's a 60-year-old is going to go around talking like a 5-year-old. What it does mean is that when it comes to thinking emotionally or feeling emotionally or having an emotional palate, they may be stuck at a certain age. And this really does come up in the therapy room. You work with clients, and the way to gauge it is to listen to what they say, listen to how they say it, and what they're struggling with. And sometimes you can hear that they're actually at a very, very younger age. And certainly for clients who've had abusive histories, it may be that when they're touching on that, they go back to that age. You may very well have a child sitting in front of you in the room. And we have to be very thoughtful of how we work with that. And one of the ways we work with that is to work as you would, I think, someone who is younger, work at the developmental age. So work with patience, work with compassion, work at a pace that they can go at. Because sometimes with people who are younger, they may need longer to process things. So it's a real skill, and one really I think that sometimes isn't touched on in training. But yeah, and you can find the emotional age. I used to say to my supervisees, if you're thinking about the client, just close your eyes. What does the client sound like? What age are they coming from? And it's amazing once the picture of the client disappears and you can hear them. Supervisees can hear the clients coming from a different emotional age. And there can be lots of reasons for that. Certainly people who may have had a difficulty with alcohol or substance misuse in the past may get stuck, because what can happen is that they move along their lives, they get involved in either a traumatic event or something to do maybe with substance misuse, or may go to prison. And what happens is, because they don't have the socialization that people who haven't had a difficult childhood have, is that they get stuck there. The socialization and our experience of life that develops our emotional palate. And if it gets stuck, you can find that, people just stick at that emotional age, and you have to work with that. It's interesting. I'm sure you've probably seen this in your practice, Ken, through the years.
Yeah. And I worked specializing in drug and alcohol recovery for some years, and it's something that we work with. And to kind of explain what is happening, as soon as a person is using a drug, alcohol, or any other kind of stimulant behavior to compensate for emotions, they're using it to kind of dull the pain. Then what is happening is those emotions are not being processed as we as humans process emotions. We feel emotions, we experience the emotions, it hurts, we carry those emotions around us for a while, we revisit those emotions, the pain remains, and we might speak about people. But when you're using a substance such as a drug or alcohol to deal with that emotion, the emotion stays at the age that it was formed, and it's not worked on, it's not processed, it is just, squashed down. So when a person is coming into recovery, very often you'll have a 55-year-old man and who found kind of, maybe an example here, drinking from the age of 18 very, very heavily to cope with how life was at that point. We're going back to that 18-year-old man to deal with those issues. And as you say, Rory, you would deal with them as you would with an 18-year-old who sat in front of you. And it is advanced. This is advanced counselling here. It's advanced practice, because you may be working at different age ranges within the same session with the same presenting person. The 55-year-old man walks in, you will greet him as a 55-year-old man. He may bring some things from the last week that he's been dealing with, and you will be speaking to a 55-year-old man. And then very quickly that can go to the pain of his mother dying when he was 18, and there we are, we're back at 18. So it's about being really vigilant and being there with the client. I think it's really about that, walking with them and fully understanding who they are, what they're bringing. And other kind of signals you might see is you can even see a change in voice sometimes. The voice might change and become more childlike. The posture of the person might change. From a strong person who looks you in the eye, they may hunch and start looking away and start acting and almost behaving like they did at that age because of the vulnerability, and they're feeling the vulnerability of that past age, I guess.
Absolutely. And as Ken said, this is an advanced skill. So this is something that usually you work with your supervisor to develop and hone. It's not something to hear on the podcast and think, "Oh right, I'll just close my eyes and think, wonder how old my client is." That's really not how it is. It's, as Ken alluded to, it can be a mixture. You may get the kind of chronological age interaction with some things, but when someone's talking about, like you say, the history of drug dependency or alcohol misuse, or when they're talking about traumatic events in their life, so at that point, people may slide back. And it's what's really important as a therapist, I think, is that if you have a client who's got it and the child is very much in the room, is a part of you that is to contain them, emotionally contain them, and support them so that they don't feel unsupported. If you think of a child talking to an adult about something, and then the adult's responding as if they're an adult, the child may not be able to conceptualize it. As someone who's a former child therapist, you have to work at the emotional age and kind of work with that. And the other thing is, I found through the years, is use of language. Sometimes you have to use very, very, very precise language when you're working with someone who's at a lower developmental age, because at that point they really are engaged as a child. So you have to be very, very accurate, very patient, and almost very, very supportive and contain them. And I think also part of that is to remind them where they are in the world, that they actually are their chronological age. You have to do that very gently, but don't let them kind of leave as if they're a 6-year-old, because that's dangerous as well. And part of that, of course, is getting training and information on trauma-informed practice, because that's really, really useful. So, chronological age. And also, I think it's really important to discuss it in supervision. I think a good supervisor will be able to give you lots of guidance on how to work with that presentation.
100%. And, you're speaking about the training. It's so important, because you mentioned somebody going back out at that kind of regressed age, and that's the last thing you need. And it's about being mindful. It's about being practiced in working with this. It's about taking it to supervision. It's about looking at your continuing professional development, as you say, Rory, before using these very advanced skills, because the last thing you want to do is 5 minutes before the end of the session have a person that is in that regressed age at that painful place. You need to kind of bring them back into the here and now, check where they are before they leave that door, make sure they're feeling strong enough. And of course, Counselling Study Resource, and we mention it all the time, it's our paid for service. That's where you'll find the CPD lectures. In fact, you're busy with one coming up this next week, Rory.
I am. I'm doing preparing to work with young people, and on the face of it, it looks like a lecture just about young people, but actually, it's worth remembering that adults were once young people, and we carry to a greater or lesser extent that young person within us. And by having a really good understanding of how to work with young people, you can work more effectively, I think, with adults. I did the child and adolescent therapy course a few years ago, and I learned a lot about being a school counsellor and working with young people, but actually I applied a lot of it to my adult practice, a lot of it, because it was just so useful.
Indeed, and more about Counselling Study Resource if you wanted to check out that lecture at the end of today's episode. And this has been episode 108. We started off speaking about linking theory, the theory to our personal development. Then we looked at letter writing in Practice Matters to other professionals and the different types of letters that we might write and what we might write in those letters. And then closing off that with working with a client's emotional age. Really good episode. I've enjoyed this.
Yeah, and hey, stay grounded, and stay safe.
Take the stress out of your counselling studies and get the support of Rory and I by joining us in the Counselling Study Resource. Counselling Study Resource, or CSR for short, is the world's most comprehensive assignment guidance and study support resource for students just like you of counselling and psychotherapy. See how Counselling Study Resource can help you. Visit counsellingtutor.com. That's counsellingtutor.com.
Thank you for listening to the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Find the show notes for this episode on our website at www.counsellingtutor.com.